He ordered a luxurious space ride, but his favorite alien pilot arrived in her mating Sycle. Daren Holt adjusted the collar of his sleek black jacket, feeling the reassuring grip of the reinforced material around his neck. The memory of standing at attention in a hangar full of uniformed officers haunted him, accompanied by the echo of his commanding officer's last curt dismissal. That was another lifetime ago, a past he was trying to put behind him. He had come to the bustling port of Alira station to start fresh. Instead of confining himself in the ranks of the Earth-based military, he was now a freelance pilot specializing in ferrying high-end travelers, an occupation he had begun to think of as freedom. On this day, however, freedom felt precariously close to slipping through his fingers. He stood in a private docking bay, posture rigid, gloved hands clasped behind his back. The polished metal floors shone in strips of reflected white-blue station lights. His short, dark brown hair, trimmed close at the sides, bore faint impressions from a neural flight helmet he'd worn earlier in the day, though he'd tried smoothing it out to project a polished professional image. His face was clean-shaven, except for a neat beard bordering his jaw. He was used to adopting this mixture of polish and ruggedness, a look that told employers he was disciplined yet unafraid of high-risk flights. A second glance revealed the tension buried in his posture, a weight in his shoulders that spoke of unspeakable regret lingering in the corners of his mind. He'd agreed to take on a job ferrying a high-ranking diplomat through a notoriously treacherous asteroid belt called the Veil of Shards, currently under the threat of solar flares. Ordinarily, he would never refuse a well-paying gig, even under high risk. But this time, his potential client had insisted on including an alien pilot to assist him. That alone might not have bothered him, except that he was also expected to cede a portion of control in navigation to her. For a man with a natural gift for reading gravitational shifts, someone who prided himself on near-flawless piloting, this was a blow to his pride, and more uncomfortably, a potential trigger for the guilt he carried. If anything went wrong, he worried it would be just like it had been when he lost his entire squad, all because he'd miscalculated a detail he shouldn't have. He always told himself he had learned from that mistake, but nightmares came regardless. He had to keep it together. At the far end of the docking bay, the wide doors hissed open, unveiling a solitary figure with fluid steps. He realized instantly it was the pilot he had been told to expect, Alira Vas'te. Even from a distance, her appearance captivated him. She wore a fitted black flight suit that shimmered faintly, as though tiny ripples of metal were woven into the fabric. Her frame was lean and athletic, and she moved with a kind of poised grace that made the busy mechanics and staff in the background momentarily fade. His gaze moved upward, catching sight of her delicately pointed ears. They extended, elegantly poking through her long black hair that was gathered at the back of her head. The overhead lights cast a subtle radiance on her pale skin, reminiscent of marble, with faint illusions of starlight glinting along its surface. She had eyes with black sclera, the irises shining silver in patterns that seemed to shift with her. Steps, as if they were reading the world around her with each blink. He gave a polite nod, a customary greeting among starship professionals, and stepped forward. "You must be Alira Vas'te," he said, voice calm, determined not to show how taken aback he was by her presence. She inclined her head in a slow, measured bow. "Captain Daren Holt." Her voice was soft but carried a certain firmness. "I was informed that you needed co-pilot assistance for the run through the Veil." Her accent was subtle and melodic, shaped, no doubt, by the dialect of her people. He realized he didn't even know exactly which species she belonged to, only that they were known for their extraordinary reflexes and empathic sensitivities. Her eyes landed on him, and he detected a faint flicker of tension behind the silver sheen, as though she was evaluating him the same way he was evaluating her. He recognized the usual friction that arose from pairing up with another pilot. Each had a method, a preference for how they wanted to do things in the cockpit. He tried a smile. "I appreciate your willingness to assist. When you're ready, we'll board the Valiant Dawn. It's my personal vessel. Well, it used to belong to a subsidiary, but I recently bought her out fully. Took a lot of jobs to pay for her." Alira nodded, stepping in closer. He could see the finely chiseled angles of her cheeks, the slender arc of her neck. "I respect the bond between pilot and craft," she said. "In my culture, there is a deep understanding that the pilot's essence merges with the vessel. I will do my best to honor your style while offering my own experience." Her tone was diplomatic, though her pointed ears twitched ever so slightly, as if from a subtle internal tension. That's when he noticed she was wearing flight goggles perched just over her forehead, a sleek design that must have had sensors or some specialized technology. Perhaps they helped her with her species' unique vision. There was a sense that beneath her outward composure she was wrestling with something. The faint flush across her cheeks gave her an uncharacteristic look of distraction. He stored that observation away for later. They approached the Valiant Dawn, a mid-sized transport ship with a glossy hull, wide thrusters, and advanced scanning arrays along the underbelly for navigating hazardous celestial regions. As they boarded, station personnel bustled about, loading the final crates of supplies and verifying the diplomat's cargo. The cargo was securely locked, labeled with official insignias Daren didn't recognize. The diplomat was scheduled to arrive soon, but for now, he and Alira had a chance to check the cockpit. While they walked, Alira seemed to observe every detail. He noticed the subtle way she tilted her head, her ears angling to pick up faint, mechanical hums and the distant hiss of venting coolant lines. As they stepped into the corridor, he caught her clicking her tongue softly, a quiet staccato sound that seemed to resonate in her throat. She glanced at him, then gave a half-apologetic smile. "My people use subtle acoustics as a form of focusing. Some might call it an echolocation, but it's more an instinct." He found that oddly charming, a quirk of her kind that made him want to learn more. He tried not to stare too long at her eyes or the lines of her face. "I understand. We each have our ways of reading an environment. I can't do much with my ears, but I've always had an instinct for gravitational shifts. My father used to say I had star charts in my blood." The corridor led them to the cockpit's sliding hatch. Inside was a compact space brimming with advanced instrumentation and wide forward windows that opened onto the docking bay exterior. Ambient lights glowed in understated strips across the ceiling. Alira, still silent, brushed her fingers along one of the control consoles, and Daren noticed the faintest twitch in her lips. "A comfortable setup," she said at last. "I can tell you keep things neat. I'll try not to disrupt your arrangement." He shrugged. "I'm open to new tactics, as long as it keeps us alive." A curt beep from his wrist communicator signaled that the diplomat had arrived and was boarding in the passenger lounge. They would launch soon. Daren swallowed, the taste of old nerves rising in him, a whisper of memory from the day his entire squad had relied on him, and how that trust had ended in tragedy. He gave the overhead compartments a final check, tested communications, and returned to Alira. "Let's head back for the pre-launch briefing with our passenger." They walked down the corridor together. Though they moved in companionable silence, he felt the air crackle with tension. Alira was clearly evaluating him, possibly reading his subtle expressions and posture for any sign of distrust or arrogance. He, in turn, found his gaze drifting toward the pale curve of her cheek or the graceful length of her neck. Whenever he tried to focus on practical concerns, an errant part of his mind kept replaying the sight of her stepping into the docking bay. He inwardly scolded himself. They had a job to do, and he couldn't let himself get distracted. They reached the lounge. Their client, a tall figure wearing ceremonial robes with geometric patterns in burgundy and gold, stood waiting. The diplomat wore a cunning smile, and behind that smile, Daren sensed the presence of a well-guarded secret. Something about the set of the man's shoulders told him that this was not going to be a simple escort. The diplomat introduced himself as Ambassador Ryth Luren and gave a flourish of gloved hands. Daren offered a polite bow, but decided not to press questions yet. He'd learned over time that pushy curiosity often led to withheld payment. He would do the job and do it well, but remain cautious. Captain Holt, Ms. Vas'te, the ambassador greeted them both in a formal, clipped tone. We depart soon, yes? My cargo must arrive unharmed. The route is treacherous, but that's why you come so highly recommended. Daren nodded. We'll do everything within reason to ensure safe passage. He tossed a glance at Alira. We will rely on our combined expertise. The Veil of Shards has been particularly unstable because of the solar flares. Alira spoke, softly, though her words held confidence. I've navigated the Veil before. If we time the gravitational anomalies right, we can slip between the asteroid clusters and avoid the worst. The flares complicate scanning, but I have a few manual maneuvers that might help. She paused, and a subtle tremor flickered along her ear tips, as though she contained some unspoken restlessness. They exchanged a few more formalities, then parted ways. The ambassador retreated to his private cabin, presumably to oversee final cargo checks or perhaps indulge in the lounge's luxuries. Daren and Alira headed for the cockpit to finalize preparations for departure. Daren took the captain's chair, strapped in, and gestured for Alira to take the co-pilot's seat. Her every movement was fluid, from the tuck of her ankles to the upright posture she maintained. Daren's mind flicked back to the last time he had co-piloted with someone. She had been a friend, part of his squad. The memory stung, and his throat tightened. He forced the recollection aside, focusing instead on the present. Coordinates locked, he said, voice carefully neutral. Ready for engine ignition. Alira ran her hands over the console, pressing luminous buttons with a gentle but deliberate touch. Initiating thruster warm-up, all systems stable. He let his thumb rub against the seam of his glove, that old habit surfacing whenever. Tension rose. The hiss of the docking clamps releasing vibrated underfoot, and the valiant Dawn smoothly lifted from its berth. Alira glanced at him to confirm readiness. He gave a curt nod. She guided the craft out into open space, weaving gracefully around the station's perimeter traffic. The immediate stretch of star-littered darkness greeted them, and the station shrank behind them with each thrust of the engines. Beyond, in the distance, lay the swirling lights of the Veil of Shards. Already, faint arcs of solar radiation flared along the edges of distant asteroids, painting them in ember-like glows that ignited in brief flashes. Daren couldn't help but let out a breath. It's beautiful from here, but up close, those shards will be spinning in chaotic orbits. One wrong calculation, and they'll shred us like a tin can. Alira's silver-irised gaze fixed on the swirling field, and he saw the faintest tremor in her hands. Perhaps it was excitement, or maybe something deeper. She inhaled, and for a moment she seemed to hold her breath as if steeling herself. I can feel the movement. There's a tide to it, like waves on my world's twin seas. If we match the rhythm and slip into the pattern, we won't be broken. He nodded, impressed. She didn't sound boastful. Rather, there was a matter-of-fact confidence in her that he had to respect. I'll sync with your approach. Just let me know what you need from me. She turned to him, those black scleras reflecting faint cockpit lights. Keep your eyes on the gravitational sensors. I suspect we may need a combined approach. Your star chart intuition with my reactions. She paused, as if uncertain how much to disclose about her species' capabilities. Then she gave a thin smile. I promise not to step on your toes too much. Despite his guarded nature, Daren found himself smiling back. I look forward to seeing you in action. They set their course, and the valiant Dawn surged forward with a subdued roar. The hum of the engines under his feet steadied him, reminding him that this was his domain, that he had control here. Alira, however, was more than just a passenger. She was a pilot in her own right, and that introduced an unknown variable. Before, he would have felt threatened, but something in her tone assured him that they could find common ground. A hint of curiosity sparked within him, cutting through the residue of guilt. As they neared the first wave of scattered asteroids, Alira inhaled a slow breath, her slender throat constricting slightly. He found his gaze lingering on her profile, noticing a small flush on her otherwise pale cheeks. She exhaled, parted her lips, and a faint click rumbled in the back of her throat. The frequency was so soft he barely caught it, but it seemed to give her a jolt of concentration. Her hands flew over the thruster controls, making minute adjustments. She was in the zone. This sector experiences random surges, Daren said, reading the sensor display. Energy from the solar flares can cause sudden gravitational pockets. If we get pulled into one, we could lose engine stability. He watched her face. She absorbed the information, her eyes flickering. We'll do short bursts to traverse. Each gap, she said. With your star chart reading, can you see where the most stable corridor lies? He brought up a holographic overlay, scanning it with practiced ease. The data was incomplete, scrambled by interference, but he had a knack for gleaning glimpses of order in the chaos. There, he said, pointing to a faint corridor. We can slip between those swirling shards if we time it precisely. Alira executed the maneuver. A wave of tension filled the cockpit as the ship dipped toward a narrow opening, with black shards of rock and glittering minerals swirling around them. A faint glow traced along the asteroids, reacting to the ship's thrusters. Every second felt precarious. The deck jolted once, a sign that they had entered a gravitational eddy. Daren's breath caught. He feared losing control, but Alira worked the controls with fearless precision, weaving them through the chaos. She leaned forward, eyes locked on the swirling shards, body taut, every muscle engaged. Despite the harshness of the environment, her expression was calm, almost serene. She thrived in this challenge, when at last they emerged from that patch of debris. Daren allowed himself a slow exhalation. "Nice work," he murmured, wiping a touch of sweat from his brow. He tapped a control to calm the engine output and restabilize. "If we keep flying like that, maybe we'll live to see the next sunrise." She shot him a sideways glance, and a small, wry grin tugged at her lips. "It's too soon for compliments. We've barely begun." Yet he could sense the pride in her tone. He was about to respond when the comms panel crackled and the ambassador's voice filled the cockpit. "We have encountered an unexpected difficulty. My sensor feeds indicate large-scale flares that could saturate the region soon. How long? Until we are clear of this belt?" Daren glanced at Alira. She gave him a curt nod, so he replied, "We'll do our best to get through as soon as possible. Some hazards can't be rushed. Safety comes first, Ambassador." The comm line clicked off without a response. Daren frowned. He didn't trust that abrupt silence. Something about the ambassador felt off. Alira must have noticed his tension, because she said softly, "I sense worry in him. It's almost palpable." "You can sense that?" "In my species, reading emotional undercurrents is easier when we're close. It's not telepathy, just we pick up signals in voice, posture, temperature. We learn them from birth. With you, even though we're newly acquainted, I notice tension around your eyes and the way you tap your thumb on your glove. It's constant." He felt a small flush creep into his cheeks. "You notice a lot." "I do." She said nothing. More. They drifted into a calmer zone between asteroids. Faint solar flares illuminated swirling dust, creating patterns of ember-like sparks. "We should use this calm to run a systems check," he said. "The next region might be more chaotic." He busied himself with the console. That gnawing guilt in the pit of his stomach flared to life again. Could he trust someone else at the helm, or was this just a path to heartbreak like before? He didn't realize he was staring at Alira until she returned his gaze. She studied. Him with those silver irises, and for a moment her expression softened. The overhead lights reflected faintly on her cheekbones, making her look almost fragile, though her piloting skill was anything but. Something about her presence was comforting, perhaps because she exuded a gentle empathy despite their precarious situation. He cleared his throat, deciding to focus on a neutral question. "So, how long have you been flying?" She leaned back in her seat. "My father taught me when I was young. Our clan believed strongly in passing skills down through the generations. Before I could even walk, I'd been immersed in flight manuals. Later I entered the pilot corps, flew on merchant vessels, took on a few covert operations when the Alliance needed me. My last mission was complicated. I can't discuss the details, but it ended with me leaving my planet for a while. That's how I ended up assisting with your mission." He nodded quietly, sensing untold trauma beneath those words. Yet she remained poised. They fell into a lull, letting the hum of the engines fill the quiet until the sensors flashed a warning, an approaching solar surge. Alira pointed to the swirl of shifting lights outside. "We'd better push through this soon, or we'll be caught in the wave." They resumed their course, weaving deeper into the belt. The bursts of scorching light outside grew more frequent, dancing across the vacuum of space. Daren's console beeped in warning. "Gravitational anomalies increasing," he said. "I'll attempt to isolate a corridor. Just stay ready." Alira nodded, tension building in her posture. She flicked a glance over him, as if deciding something. "I haven't been entirely truthful with you," she said quietly, her tone cautious. "I agreed to come on this job because I am entering my cycle. My species has a certain period called the cycle of fusion. It's a mating cycle, but more than that, it heightens our emotional and physical senses. The reason I was chosen is because I'm at my peak reflexes, but the cycle can also be risky. If I let my emotions overpower me, I could make mistakes." That disclosure hung in the air. Daren stared at her, not sure how to respond. He blinked, cheeks flushing slightly at the mention of mating cycle. "I didn't realize. Is that going to interfere with your performance?" She pressed her lips together, looking genuinely vulnerable for the first time. "I'll manage. I know my limits, but you should understand that my instincts, especially regarding closeness, might be stronger than normal. It doesn't make me lose control, but it can complicate matters if I become too emotionally entangled." He felt a subtle warmth in his chest, a flutter of intrigue tinted with caution. "We're professionals," he said, more stiffly than intended. "We'll get the job done." She gave him a wry smile as the reflection of an asteroid's ember-like glow traced across her cheeks. "Yes, we will." She turned her focus back to the controls. Despite that, the revelation lingered between them. He couldn't help feeling drawn to her. But with her species' cycle in play, everything would be magnified, for better or worse. He had no intention of getting caught in some ephemeral bond, yet in the short time he'd known her, he sensed a connection forming. That made him uncomfortable, because it poked at the old pain inside him, the fear of losing someone who depended on him. As the environment grew more volatile, the shift in gravitational forces became abrupt. Alira took the helm, nimble fingers dancing on the console, adapting their flight path. Daren mapped out sudden bursts of data, calling out coordinates. "Bank left by 3 degrees. There's an incoming cluster on the right. If we catch that small opening, we can avoid the flare at 2 o'clock. She obeyed, the ship rolling, gracefully. They nearly brushed a chunk of jagged rock. Sparks flew across the hull, but they slipped by unscathed. Daren's heart pounded. He caught sight of the largest shard in the cluster, its surface shimmering with lines of molten ore. The solar flares lit it in scorching oranges and reds, like a chunk of a burning planet. "We have to push thrusters now, or we'll get caught in the next wave," he warned. Alira nodded. "Hold tight." She jammed the thruster lever forward, and the valiant Dawn shot into a tight passage between two rotating shards. The entire cockpit rattled. The gravity well from the rotating masses threatened to yank them in, but Alira adjusted the stabilizers at precisely the right moment. Then, as if by instinct, she fired the maneuvering thrusters, tipping them just enough to slip free from the danger zone. For a few seconds, the only sound was the frantic thumping of Daren's heartbeat in his ears. He stared at Alira in amazement, and she spared him a sideways glance, her lips trembling into the ghost of a smile. "We made it through that cluster," she breathed. He let out a whoosh of air. "That was some of the best piloting I've ever seen," he admitted. Pride flickered in her eyes. "Thank you. Your data reading was perfect timing. I can't do that alone." They shared a moment of understanding. Different backgrounds, different species, yet in that harrowing sequence they had functioned as a single unit. Daren felt a stirring of something in his chest, equal parts admiration and a deeper pull that unsettled him. He forced himself to focus on the job. "We're not out of trouble yet," he said, scanning the readouts. "The storm sector is ahead, and we've got word of an emerging pirate faction active in these zones. The Ember Vultures, or so I've heard." Alira's jaw tightened. "They prey on vulnerable ships during flare storms. We'll have to stay alert." The valiant Dawn glided forward, the belt gradually thinning around them. Through the forward viewport, Daren saw the scattered bursts of solar flares washing the starscape in ominous red flickers. His instincts squirmed. Something was off. Then, sure enough, a shiver of interference rippled through their communications console. "Calm jam," he muttered, tapping the display. "One guess who might be responsible." The console flickered, and a partial voice crackled through. "Val and Dawn, identify." The line fizzled out. Another wave of interference. Daren cursed quietly. He tried rerouting signals, but the partial jam persisted. He glanced at Alira, who was scanning outside. "They're near," she said, tension returning to her posture. "I can sense it. They thrive on this chaos." A metallic clang echoed through the hull. Daren's stomach twisted. Tractor beam or a grappling device, he guessed, scanning the external cameras. Sure enough, a small, nimble craft bristling with dorsal weapons had latched onto them from behind a drifting shard. Even with the belt's hazards, the pirates had found a way to mount an ambush. Alira tightened her hands around the controls. "I can try an evasive spin, but if they're locked on with grapples, we'll damage the ship if we yank free." He clenched his jaw. "We might not have a choice. I'd rather dent the hull than get boarded by pirates." Before they could execute the maneuver, a snarling voice blared through the newly restored comm channel, overriding their systems. "We are the Ember Vultures. Power down and surrender your cargo. We have no need for your lives, but try. Anything clever and we'll fill your hull with plasma holes." Daren's eyes flicked toward the passenger lounge corridor. The ambassador and his cargo might have something these pirates wanted. He hated feeling cornered. "We're carrying a passenger," he whispered to Alira. "We need to confirm what we're up against." She nodded, but she looked tense, almost distracted. His gaze drifted to her parted lips, the delicate point of her ears, the subtle flush creeping along her cheeks. Her cycle must be intensifying. In a stressful situation, her emotional responses would spike. He tried to shake off the sudden wave of protectiveness that gripped him. He opened the private channel to the passenger lounge. "Ambassador, we're being attacked by pirates. Any chance your cargo is of interest to them?" There was a lengthy pause. Then the ambassador's voice came through, gruff and panicked. "I carry nothing but diplomatic goods. However, they might assume it is of value. They have no right to confiscate it. You must repel them." Daren almost rolled his eyes. That was hardly reassuring. He closed the channel. "They're going to try to board us if we don't comply. That leaves us with few options. I suggest we yank free of their grapple, but we'll have to time it so they don't blast us to pieces." Alira clenched her jaw. "On my mark, punch the starboard thrusters. I'll tilt the ship's axis. It should shear their grapple if the angle is right. But be warned, we might get some hull damage." He nodded. Better a battered hull than letting them board. He prepared the thruster control. His heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline laced with that familiar dread. Don't fail. Don't fail again. Alira took a deep breath, obviously trying to steady her heightened senses. 3, 2, 1, now! Daren slammed the thruster. The valiant Dawn lurched, engines roaring. Alira twisted the ship's orientation, and a screech of metal tore through the hull. The pirate craft's grapple lines snapped, scattering sparks across the starfield. The pirates retaliated with a burst of plasma fire. One shot sizzled across the dorsal plating, but the angled movement caused most of the volley to miss. The ship's cockpit jolted from the impact, but they were still flying. "We're free," Daren breathed. "But they'll chase us." Even as he said it, the sensors showed the pirate vessels spinning around, lining up for pursuit. The valiant Dawn wasn't built for dogfights. It was a transport, albeit one with a decent sublight engine. "We'll have to navigate deeper into the belt and hope they can't follow." Alira's eyes narrowed. "Then we pit the veil against them. They can jam comms, but they can't jam asteroids." The next several minutes became a blur of frenzied flight. Alira piloted with daring maneuvers that skirted dangerously close to rotating shards, forcing the pirates to either break off or risk collision. Daren monitored the gravitational anomalies, calling out warnings. Together, they performed a lethal dance through the drifting debris and swirling flares. At one point, the pirate ship nearly cornered them, but Alira's reflexes kicked in at the last second. She hammered the thrusters, diving them beneath a massive chunk of rock that was about to crack apart under a flare. The resulting explosion of molten fragments momentarily blinded the pirate senses, and the valiant Dawn slipped away. When they finally lost their pursuers, both pilots slumped in their seats, breathing hard. Sparks popped from an overhead panel. Daren quickly diverted power from the damaged system. The tension in the cockpit was overwhelming, a testament to how close they'd come to destruction. Alira pressed a hand against her temple, eyes closed as if battling a wave of dizziness. He reached out, wanting to help, but hesitant to intrude. On her personal space, she sensed his concern. "I'm all right," she whispered, exhaling slowly. "It's just the Sycle. High stress intensifies everything. My senses are on overload." He nodded, trying to remain professional, but there was a pull between them, an awareness that neither wanted to acknowledge yet. He coughed gently and busied himself with the sensor readouts. "We put some distance between us and the pirates, but we can't relax. Let's find a quiet pocket to make repairs." They limped deeper into the belt until they found a relatively stable zone where smaller shards orbited at a safe distance. There they halted the ship behind a large drifting mass, using it as cover. The swirling glow of the flares illuminated the veil in ghostly arcs. Daren put the vessel into a low-power standby, hoping to hide from further detection. Together, they left the cockpit to assess the damage. A scorched gash marred the dorsal hull, though fortunately it hadn't penetrated the interior. They'd lost partial shield capacity, and some hull plating needed immediate sealing. Alira insisted on helping. They donned lightweight environment suits, stepping into a pressurized chamber that would allow them to venture onto the hull. As they stood side by side in the cramped chamber, Daren felt a heightened awareness of her presence. He was close enough to catch the faint, intriguing scent of her like a trace of metallic dusk. Through the visor of her suit, her silver eyes regarded him curiously, and he wondered if she sensed his heart pounding. He checked the seal on her suit, trying not to linger on the graceful line of her throat. Then they cycled the airlock. Emerging onto the dorsal hull, they were greeted by an awe-inspiring sight, the black expanse of space laced with fiery arcs of solar flares, while asteroids in the distance glittered like broken glass under the violent bursts. The swirl of dust and debris cast fleeting shadows across the hull. Alira stepped forward with a plasma welder in hand. As she engaged the tool to fuse a tear in the plating, her posture was tense, yet focused. Daren held a portable shield generator to block potential micro-debris. Scanning the environment carefully, he risked a glance at her. The reflection of cosmic fire danced across her visor, highlighting her pointed ears within the helmet. She finished sealing a section, then turned to check the reading on a console strapped to her arm. A subtle tremor rippled through her posture, and she pressed a hand against the hull to steady herself. He frowned, stepping closer. "Alira, are you feeling all right?" Her voice crackled through the helmet comm. "Yes. The environment, the Sycle. It's like I'm experiencing every sight, every sound at tenfold intensity. It's not unbearable, just overwhelming. And then there's—" She didn't finish, but her gaze lingered on him for a moment before she looked away. He looked down, tightening his grip on the shield generator. He recalled how she'd admitted that the Sycle heightened emotional responses. The tension between them felt electric. The brush of her suit against his as they worked side by side sent pulses of awareness through him. He struggled to compartmentalize his feelings. This wasn't the time or place to lose focus. Still, they had to talk. "Alira," he began. "Carefully, I know we don't know each other well, but if you need relief or help with something related to your Sycle, I want to be supportive. I'm not sure how your species handles it, but—" She turned her head sharply, meeting his gaze through the visors. "I appreciate the concern," she said, her voice husky. "But it's not something that can be toggled on or off. My emotions, my instincts, they're heightened, yes, and they do drive me toward closeness. But I won't let it disrupt our mission. We have a job to do." Something in her tone hinted at a deeper longing, though, and he found himself unable to ignore it. "Understood," he said softly, "but you should know I respect you, not just your skills, but who you are. I've flown with many pilots, and rarely have I seen such grace under pressure." The soft crackle of the comm line was her only reply for a moment. Then she murmured, "Thank you." They resumed welding the damaged plating, working in dense companionship. Finally the repairs were done, at least enough to ensure hull integrity. They retreated to the airlock, ran the repressurization cycle, and removed their helmets. Back in the corridor, they peeled off the environment suits. Alira's hair had become damp near her temples, and her cheeks carried a flush. He realized she was probably burning with heat from the Sycle, among other things. Without speaking, they headed to the engine room to finalize the maintenance checks. As they walked, the lights overhead flickered once. Daren tried to keep his focus on the broken wires that needed reconnection. Alira knelt near the main console, passing him tools. Despite the tension, they worked in near harmony, words unnecessary. After a while, he secured the final conduit and powered up the system. The low hum of the engine returned, reassuring him. He turned to Alira, leaning against a bulkhead. "We should get some rest," he said quietly. "Take shifts. We'll slip through the rest of the belt at partial power tomorrow, once we know the pirates have moved on." Alira exhaled, clearly exhausted. "I agree. I'll stay up a bit to track any energy spikes, then I'll rest." She rose slowly, smoothing down the front of her suit. "Daren, thank you for trusting me with your ship. I know that's not easy for you." He gave her a subdued look. "It's not, but you've more than earned it." He couldn't resist, adding gently, "I'm sorry if my own anxieties have complicated things. This mission is stirring up old ghosts from my past." She studied him. "Perhaps we can talk about those ghosts sometime." He felt a lump in his throat. "Maybe we can. Good night, Alira." With that, he stepped away and headed for his quarters, ignoring the persistent thrum of awareness that reminded him she was mere steps behind. He dreaded the possibility that her Sycle might further entangle them, yet he couldn't deny the spark he felt in her presence. He took his usual bunk in the captain's quarters, but sleep came fitfully. He dreamt of the old tragedy. The screams of his squad, the flames on the horizon, his own failure to chart a safe route. Waking in a cold sweat, he sat upright. The quiet hum of the ship surrounded him. Outside the small viewport, the scattered embers of the veil flickered. Guilt squeezed his chest. Needing water, he left his cabin and headed toward the galley. To his surprise, the lounge lights were dimmed, and Alira was seated alone at the small table. She still wore her suit, though she had unzipped the collar. Her long black hair draped across one shoulder. The overhead luminescence kissed her pale skin with gentle highlights. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze. He froze, unsure whether to approach or turn back. "You couldn't sleep?" she asked, voice hushed. He stepped closer. "Nightmares." "You?" She offered a small shrug. "Agitation from the Sycle, I suppose. Plus, I'm worried the pirates will come back." She paused, then gestured to the seat across from her. "Sit, if you like." He did so, feeling uncomfortably aware of her presence. The tension between them was undeniable, dark and simmering, laced with an odd sense of belonging. They sat, in silence for a long moment, the hum of the life support system filling the empty spaces. She brushed a hand over her ear, the pointed tip twitching slightly. "I want to tell you something," she said. "I feel drawn to you. Maybe it's the Sycle amplifying my senses, or maybe it's just the synergy we found in the cockpit, but I can't ignore it. I don't want to complicate things, but I also don't want to pretend this pull doesn't exist." His throat constricted. He'd felt it too, even before she spoke it aloud. "I understand," he whispered. "I don't know how wise it is to act on these feelings, but there's something here, and it's not just physical." He rubbed his thumb along the seam of his glove. "I lost people I cared about, people who trusted me. It still haunts me. I can't let that happen again." She reached out, gently placing her hand atop his. Her skin was warm to the touch, almost feverish. Loss is part of life in the stars. It doesn't mean we stop connecting or stop trusting. A shiver ran through him at her contact. He knew her Sycle was influencing her heightened emotions, but the sincerity in her eyes was real. He slid his hand to entwine with hers, feeling that subtle closeness. "This is a bad idea," he murmured with a reluctant smile. "I'm your partner on this mission. We're in mortal danger. It's hardly the time for romance." She let out a whisper of a laugh. "Danger sometimes makes us see what truly matters." She rose slightly, and he found himself mirroring her movement until they stood face to face. The lounge lights were dim, painting soft shadows along her jaw and collarbones. Her pointed ears, so distinctly alien, framed her face in a way that accentuated her beauty. He lifted a trembling hand, brushing his fingertips gently against her cheek. Her eyelids drifted shut at the contact. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, voice husky with a mixture of desire and trepidation. She opened her eyes, silver swirling in their depths. "I am," she said, "but only if you are too." He swallowed hard. Then, for the first time in years, he let himself give in. He leaned forward, brushing his lips softly across hers. The touch ignited something within them both, fueling the tension that had been building. She pressed closer, arms sliding around his waist. Her tongue clicked softly, an involuntary sign of her body's excitement, perhaps. He felt her exhale a shaky breath against his cheek. They might have stayed that way for seconds or hours, locked in each other's arms, hearts pounding. Eventually, the press of bodies grew more urgent, and he guided her gently to the bunk area behind the lounge. The corridor was dark, the hum of the ship the only witness to their footsteps. At the entrance to a small private berth, they turned to face each other again. The subtle warmth of her body radiated even through the thin fabric of her suit. Desire surged, but so did an unexpected wave of tenderness. He cupped her face, gazing into those shifting silver irises. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, "or lead you on." Her lips curved into a sad half-smile. "I'm no stranger to heartbreak, Captain Holt, but sometimes we risk it, or we remain alone." In the dark, she tugged at his jacket, pulling him into the berth. Their mouths met again in a flurry of whispered need. Clothes slipped away in the hush of the moment. pale skin against his tanned body. His gloved hand slid over the contour of her back, and she shuddered. She let out a sigh that resonated with longing. The cycle was likely intensifying every sensation, but it also felt real to him, a merging of hearts that overshadowed the fear in his chest. They sank into the bunk, the gentle press of her form against his overwhelming in its intimacy. Time blurred. The hush of the starship and the faint flicker of emergency lights were the only witnesses to their union. He was keenly aware of how her species might differ from his, but all that mattered was the closeness, the trust. Their breathing turned ragged, shared warmth, a tumble of limbs and hushed gasps, as though both sought solace in a universe that offered little. She pressed a trembling kiss to his shoulder, and he tucked her hair aside to trail gentle touches along the pointed curve of her ear. She whimpered softly, an exquisite mix of pleasure and vulnerability. Eventually, a haze of spent passion and quiet awe enveloped them. He lay on his back, heart throbbing. Alira curled beside him with one arm draped across his chest. The faint metal ripples of her flight suit lay discarded at the bunk's edge. Her ear twitched in the darkness, and he felt her breath on his collarbone. "Daren," she whispered. "Thank you." He brushed a knuckle across her cheek. "For what?" She closed her eyes. "For seeing me as more than just a pilot in heat. For letting me be vulnerable." He didn't know how to respond to that, so he kissed her forehead. It was enough. They lingered in that cocoon of warmth for a while, hearts easing into a rare moment of peace. Eventually, reality seeped back, reminding them that the ship was damaged. The ambassador had secrets and pirates roamed outside, but for those precious minutes, the world had shrunk to just the two of them. Eventually, they dressed again in silence, exchanging shy smiles as if acknowledging how drastically their relationship had changed. When they re-emerged into the corridor, the tension that once defined their dynamic had softened into something more intimate. Daren led her back to the cockpit hand in hand until duty reclaimed them. The rest of the night cycle passed quietly. The ambassador stayed in his quarters, presumably oblivious to the events. Daren took the next shift, at the helm, letting Alira rest. He found it difficult to focus with the lingering warmth of her presence in the bunk, fresh in his mind, but he managed. Gradually, the sensor readings showed no sign of the pirate ship, allowing him to relax just a fraction. When Alira awoke and returned to the cockpit some hours later, her eyes shone with a mix of determination and tenderness. He felt an immediate spike of yearning at the sight of her, but they had a mission to complete, so he forced himself to remain composed. Without any word spoken, they quietly recommenced the approach, carefully edging out of their hiding spot. The storm had subsided a bit, though flares still flickered across the belt. He scanned the corridor ahead. "If we push through the next cluster, we'll reach open space. Then we can jump to the trade route that leads to the ambassador's destination. Let's get this done." Alira guided the ship forward. The thrusters hummed, the hull-plated repairs holding firm. Daren kept an eye on the readouts for any sign of the ember vultures. Though the belt was still dangerous, he felt safer with Alira at his side. He marveled at how quickly his perspective had shifted. Before, the thought of relinquishing control terrified him. Now he welcomed her skill and trusted her instincts. They navigated another wave of drifting shards. This time, it felt almost effortless, their synergy so natural it was as if they shared a single mind. She would tilt the ship right. He would modulate the engine output to steady them, and they'd slip through a gap with meters to spare. But it wasn't a casual flight. At any moment, a rock could spin unpredictably, or a flare might blindside them. And that moment came sooner than they expected. A sudden surge of solar radiation erupted ahead, sending shockwaves through the asteroid cluster. The shards spun madly, collisions igniting miniature blasts of molten fragments. Alira swore under her breath. The corridor they'd aimed for vanished in a chaotic swirl of debris. Daren quickly recalculated, tapping furiously. "We need a new route." he said. Alira flicked her gaze across the swirling destruction. We'll pivot and circle around, but hold on, this is going to be tight. She spun the ship's nose, reversing thrusters to try a half-loop. A flurry of smaller fragments pelted the hull, rattling them. The ship's frame groaned. Daren furiously overrode the stabilizer alarm. A chunk of debris the size of a house tumbled right into their path. Alira pulled hard on the flight stick. The valiant Dawn angled upward, just missing a collision. Their underside scraped the rock with a teeth-gnashing shriek. Alira cried out as sparks flared across the cockpit windows. Then, unbelievably, they broke free of the swirling maelstrom. Spinning shards receded behind them. The ship wobbled, but stabilized. Daren hammered at the console, locking in a safe heading. They drifted into a calmer pocket. Both pilots gasped for breath, hearts pounding. A hush descended for a few seconds as they comprehended their survival. Alira rested her forehead against the seat's headrest, eyes closed. "Are you all right?" he asked, voice hoarse. She nodded but didn't speak right away. He noticed her trembling. He reached over and gently covered her hand with his. She squeezed it, swallowing thickly. "It's so intense," she whispered. "Physically, emotionally. Every near-death moment resonates in me, multiplied by the Sycle. I'm trying not to let it overwhelm me." She slid her gaze to him, and he saw tears shining in her silver irises. "But I can't stop thinking about how close we came to being space dust." He knew the feeling all too well. "We made it," he said softly. "We did it together." She nodded, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. He longed to comfort her properly, but she pushed herself upright, attempting to restore composure. "Let's keep going," she said. "We still have a mission." He admired her determination and gave her a supportive look. With one final set of maneuvers, they exited the belt. The starlit expanse of open space opened before them like a promise of safety. Daren exhaled, shoulders easing. "We're clear. Now we can plot a direct course to the rendezvous point." He paused to check the long-range scans. No sign of the Ember Vultures for now. Alira nodded. "Let's hope they gave up or got caught in the flares." They set a cruising velocity, letting the jump engines spool up for a short skip through safe coordinates. Daren keyed the passenger lounge. "Ambassador, we've cleared the Veil of Shards. Estimate arrival at your destination in a few hours." The line crackled, then Lauren's voice replied, "I trust the damage is minimal. Ensure my cargo remains safe. I will be preparing for disembarkation." Daren frowned at the man's dismissive tone, but responded politely. "Of course, sir." The channel cut. He glanced at Alira, who wore a concerned frown of her own. She said, "He's hiding something, I can feel it. His tension is laced with secrecy." She pressed her lips together. "If we deliver him, and something illicit is discovered in that cargo, we could be blamed or become targets of more dangerous factions." Daren sighed, pulling off his flight glove and flexing his fingers. "We can't just open his cargo. That'd breach our contract, and maybe it's just official state secrets. We're mercenaries in this arrangement, basically." Alira bit her lower lip, her pointed ears angling back. He could tell she felt conflicted. "I was raised to value honor, but also to question suspicious authority. Perhaps the right decision is to remain vigilant until we reach the drop-off." He nodded. "Agreed. We don't have to pry, but we won't let ourselves be used." He regarded her for a long moment, the swirl of old guilt in his chest. Yet he realized that with Alira he felt something new, the courage to face the unknown without letting fear govern him. He wondered if that was part of the bond they were forging. "We'll face this together," he said softly, her cheeks tinted pink. She nodded, blinking away moisture in her eyes. "Thank you." They engaged the short-range jump drives, the star field stretching into brilliant lines before them. The valiant Dawn vanished from local space in a pulse of ripple-like light. Moments later, they dropped out near a mid-sized planet, ringed by a shimmering orbit of metallic dust. It was a neutral zone, favored by traders and diplomatic envoys. Planetary beacons blinked along the ring's edges, guiding ships in for landing. as they approached the assigned landing platform on a floating city that hovered above the planet's surface. Daren studied the swirling atmosphere below. It looked tinted with bronze. The floating city had a crystalline infrastructure that glowed faintly, perhaps powered by geothermal vents from the planet's core. Massive spires jutted from a central hub, with docking rings spaced around it. He eased the ship to the designated pad. Alira managed the thrusters, calibrating to the local gravity. A gentle touchdown. The docking clamps locked on. Daren cut. The engines. They shared a relieved look, safe at least for the moment. They met in the corridor by the lounge to escort the ambassador and oversee cargo unloading. Rith Luren stepped forward, draped in those regal robes, scanning Daren and Alira for signs of undue curiosity. "I trust you'll handle the disembarkation with discretion," the man said pointedly. "We have an agreement, do we not?" So Daren kept his tone calm. "Of course, Ambassador. Our job was to see you through the veil safely. Now that we're here, your business is your own." As cargo droids began to move the crates from the hold, Alira lingered near the open container hatch, exchanging a meaningful glance with Daren. She mouthed, "Stay alert." He gave a subtle nod. Suddenly, a group of armed enforcers emerged onto the pad. Their uniforms bore the insignia of the planet's security force. One officer stepped forward. "Ambassador Luren, we have reason to believe you are transporting unregistered energy cores. Hand over your crates immediately for inspection." The ambassador's face darkened. "This is an outrage. I have diplomatic immunity. My cargo is not subject to local laws." The officer's glare hardened. "Not when it poses a threat. Step aside." Luren shot a desperate look at Daren and Alira. "You are under contract to protect me and my shipment. Do something." Daren and Alira exchanged uneasy looks. Their contract didn't include clashing with local authorities. They had no desire to start a firefight on a peaceful station, especially if the cargo was illegal. Alira studied the enforcers and said quietly to Daren, "They're being cautious, not hostile. The last thing we need is to join the ambassador in smuggling charges." Daren nodded. "I'm not attacking local law enforcement for him." Ambassador Luren snarled, "You betray me? Do you realize what you're throwing away? The payment, your reputations." Daren stepped forward, voice level. "You withheld crucial information from us. We had to fight off pirates for a cargo that might be contraband. That's on you, not us." The standoff bristled, but Luren had no move to make. The cargo droids continued unloading, and the enforcers prepared to inspect. Alira gently placed a hand on Daren's arm, pulling him a step back. She whispered, "We should let them do their job. This isn't our fight." He nodded. The ambassador looked ready to explode, but with no recourse, he turned to the enforcers, who confiscated the crates. Luren was led away under protest, presumably for questioning. Daren and Alira were left standing on the pad, the hum of the city around them, uncertain whether they'd still receive partial payment. But at that point, they didn't care. They'd done their job ethically. Daren turned to Alira. "At least we're off the hook, hopefully." She exhaled. "Better to walk away with a clean conscience than entangle ourselves in his lies. My only concern is the cost of the ship repairs we still need." He let out a weary laugh. "I'll figure something out. Maybe take on a few more legitimate transport gigs." His voice trailed off as he realized that they might go separate ways now that the contract was fulfilled. A pang of sorrow surprised him. Did he want her to leave? Alira shifted her weight, ears flicking. "I might stay with you," she ventured, her cheeks coloring faintly. "If you'll have me. There's more out there to explore. And she cleared her throat. "I haven't felt so free in a long time." His heart soared. "You're welcome to stay. I can't think of a better co-pilot." She nodded, but her gaze told him that co-pilot wasn't the only role she wanted to fill in his life. The swirl of her silver irises glinted with warmth and a kind of longing that matched his own. He reached out, and she entwined her fingers with his. Standing there, beneath the floating city's gilded walkways, they allowed themselves a private moment to savor the relief of having survived and the promise of what lay ahead. They spent the next hours tending to the necessary protocols. The station's port officials gave them clearance to remain, provided they checked in for routine hull inspections. Daren arranged the repairs and completed some forms, verifying that they were free of responsibility for the ambassador's contraband. Alira assisted, though he noticed her occasionally pressing a hand to her stomach or rubbing her temple. Her cycle was probably still raging. When the day wore on and the repairs began in earnest, they took a break, stepping away from the clang of tools on the Valiant Dawn's hull. They found a small observation platform near the station's edge. Through transparent walls, they could see the swirling bronze atmosphere below. Threads of cloud twisted across the planet's horizon, lit by the city's suspended luminescence. She stood at the railing, arms crossed, hair gently swaying in the artificial breeze. He joined her, leaning his forearms against the rail. He admired the line of her profile, the faint blush across her cheeks. She glanced at him. "I keep expecting you to regret this," she murmured. "Us." He slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her gently closer. "I don't. My regrets come from past failures, not from you. I never thought I'd open up to anyone again. But something about you makes it feel right." Her eyes glistened. "For my people, the cycle is a time when we can form strong bonds. But it's not just hormones. It's genuine emotion. Sometimes we bond with a mate for life. Other times it's fleeting, but still meaningful. I don't know what this will be for us, but I believe it's real." He pressed his forehead against hers, letting their breath mingle. "I believe it too. And I don't want it to end just because the cycle will pass." She tightened her arms around him, their bodies fitting together with surprising ease. They lingered like that, ignoring the curious glances of passers-by. The tension that had once defined them was replaced by a gentle comfort. The emptiness he'd carried, that guilt-laden hole in his heart, felt patched over by her presence. He didn't want to label it too soon, but it was something strong, something he might even call love one day. They returned to the ship as dusk approached. The station's lights dimmed in a cycle meant to mimic night. Alira followed him to the quarters, and he once again found himself enveloped by her closeness. This time, there was no frantic adrenaline. Their intimacy grew from the glow of mutual relief and the promise of a shared future. The suit's zipper slid easily, her pale skin luminous in the low cabin lights. He traced her ear's delicate tip, recalling how she had shivered last time. She responded with a soft noise of pleasure. In the hush of that second union, he saw her open her eyes, those black scleras and swirling silver irises reflecting his face. The vulnerability there made him want to protect her, and to let her protect him in turn, lips against lips, hands exploring. Her cycle-driven warmth rose between them like a gentle flame, and the quiet, urgent motion of their bodies spoke of both solace and longing. If earlier had been a desperate release, now it was a deliberate expression of trust and care. They sank into the moment, the planet's swirling glow beyond their window, a faint backdrop to their whispered confessions of desire. When they emerged much later, they lay wrapped in each other's arms. She rested her head against his chest, ear angled to pick up his heartbeat. He stroked her hair, marveling at how quickly they'd gone from strangers to lovers. Normally, he'd have questioned it, but after all they'd been through, it felt less like a rash choice and more like a natural evolution. She spoke in a sleepy murmur. "Will you tell me about your squad, the one you lost?" His chest tightened. No one had asked him that in a long time, but somehow in the twilight of that tender moment, he felt ready. So he told her about the mission gone wrong, the misread charts, the ambush, how one by one his friends died because he hadn't planned correctly. She listened without interruption, occasionally squeezing his hand in silent empathy. Tears gathered at the corners of his eyes, but it was a relief, a catharsis he hadn't known he needed. By the end, he was exhausted but oddly lighter. She kissed his temple. "I'm sorry for that loss, but you honor them by learning, by continuing to fly, by saving others." A single tear slipped down his cheek, and she brushed it away gently. "Thank you," he whispered. In that quiet space they drifted into a contented doze. When morning lights brightened in the station, they were awakened by the clang of repair crews outside. They dressed, sharing little smiles of gratitude. Daren's posture felt renewed, as though some old knot in his soul had loosened. They spent the day finalizing repairs and negotiating new contracts. Word spread that they had managed a safe run through the Veil of Shards, and a few prospective clients showed interest in employing the valiant Dawn. The repairs cost a hefty sum, but a local official, grateful for their refusal to aid the ambassadors, and muggling, pulled some strings to offer them a discounted berth fee. It was a minor victory that buoyed their spirits. In the afternoon, Alira caught up with him as he was reviewing the star charts in the cockpit. She slid into the co-pilot's seat, crossing one leg over the other. He shot her a warm look. "Everything good?" She nodded. "Yes, I was wondering, where do we go from here?" She gestured at the swirling cosmos on the holo display. He took a breath. "Wherever we want. You said you might stay with me. Does that still stand?" She leaned forward, resting her chin on her folded hands. "It does. There's a route to my homeworld, not too far from here, if you're curious, but I won't pressure you." He scanned the chart, noticing an unmarked cluster. "That's the region with twin suns you mentioned, the reflective seas. It sounds incredible." He recalled her describing how the watery surfaces shimmered like liquid metal. "I'd like to see it, and maybe we can pick up some cargo runs. On the way, pay for the journey." Her smile lit her face. "I'd be honored to show you my home, but be warned, my people might be curious about you." She paused, a playful gleam in her eye. "And about us?" He laughed softly. "I think I can handle curiosity after everything we've been through." They busied themselves planning the route. Each new step in the conversation felt more like they were forging a life path together, not just planning a flight. It was exhilarating and frightening, but the fear didn't dominate him anymore. Alira had helped him realize that he could trust again, let someone in without condemning them to tragedy. As evening fell over the floating city, they disembarked for a final walk around the docking ring. They found a quiet balcony that jutted out from the spires. Metal grates underfoot glowed faintly with embedded lights. The planets bronze-tinted. Clouds churned below. Soft winds brushed their hair. Daren gazed at Alira in the golden light, her slender figure outlined by the shimmering atmosphere. He took her hands, feeling their warmth. "When we first met, I was sure co-piloting with anyone would tear open old wounds. But flying with you made me realize that synergy can be beautiful. I don't want to fly alone anymore." Her eyes glowed with emotion. "I never thought I'd open my heart to someone outside my own species, especially during my cycle. But you make me feel safe, understood, even cherished. I want to see what the universe holds for us." He brought her hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles. "Then let's keep going together, if that's what you want." She nodded, her eyes brimming. He leaned in, capturing her mouth in a slow, tender kiss. It was an unhurried gesture full of unspoken promises. The passing station dwellers might have seen them, but the moment felt private and profound. They returned to the ship late, hearts light. After a decent night's rest, they woke early to finalize departure. The docking clamps released, and the valiant Dawn rose from the platform, engines rumbling with renewed strength. From the cockpit windows, the swirling city lights fell away beneath them. Alira keyed in a course for her homeworld, the route weaving around a handful of star systems. As the jump drive spooled, Daren watched her with a warm smile. The last time they had engaged these engines, it was to begin a dangerous job that had tested their limits. Now it was a journey of choice, a quest to explore new possibilities together. The starfield stretched once more into brilliant lines as they made the jump. When they dropped out, they were alone in a quiet corridor of space, far from the swirl of pirates and smuggled goods. Through the viewport, one of the twin suns of Alira's region glowed softly in the distance. Daren reached for her hand on the console. She squeezed it, her silver eyes reflecting the star's light. He let his gaze drift across the controls. The readouts were stable, the ship humming with promise. He exhaled, brimming with quiet contentment. Yes, there might be new challenges ahead, but they would face them together. No leftover illusions of guilt could overshadow that simple truth. They'd found each other. He guided the ship forward, and she assisted with the next series of maneuvers. Each step, each throttle adjustment, each sensor reading felt like a metaphor for the trust they shared. The specter of his past loss still lingered, but it no longer held him hostage. He had found a partner who was as courageous as she was kind, and she had found someone who would not shy away from her vulnerabilities. They picked up speed, the twin suns looming ever larger in the viewport. The space between them was awash with the soft glimmer of cosmic dust. Alira turned to him, her voice tinged with awe. "We'll see the reflection seas soon, once we clear the horizon. Then you'll know why my people love the interplay of light and water. It's shaped our entire culture." He smiled. "I can't wait." Her ear tips twitched in a flicker of excitement. Then she leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Thank you for letting me be by your side." He squeezed her hand. "Where else would I want you?" They faced forward together, the wide cosmos unfurling like a promise. The engines hummed steadily as the valiant dawn soared ever onward. In that moment, Daren felt the weight of his past slip further away, replaced by the bright future he and Alira would forge. Their bond was real, fueled by trust, shared danger, and the vulnerability they had exposed in each other's arms. And so they traveled deeper into the starry expanse, hearts steady, never looking back at the shadowy regrets that once consumed them. Whatever they encountered next, be it wonder or peril, they would meet it side by side, guided by the synergy of logic and instinct, and by the newfound love that bound them. They might have begun as pilot and co-pilot on a risky mission, but now they were companions charting a course to a place he had never known, a home that would become his as well. Outside the viewport, cosmic radiance pulsed in time with their hopes. The valiant dawn carried them onward, into a horizon that glowed with the possibility of something both final and infinite, a choice to embrace each other, fully and without fear. And in that choice, they found their future.